friends. First, of course, I'm very grateful that I have been invited to speak to this audience. All of you have so kindly come, and the book I have recently written is being discussed. So much has been said about the book that I don't really want to take too much time further repeating the arguments. So I'll be brief because I want some questions to be there about the basic thesis of the book. But let me just very briefly say about half an hour or so, summarize what I consider the main important parts of the book. There are two propositions which liberal thinkers generally advance. The first proposition is that while liberalism is concerned with individual freedom, Marxism is not. Marxism is concerned with things like ending exploitation, changing property relations in society, but the individual does not play as important a role in Marxist theory as it does in the liberal theory. The second proposition is that really capitalism is a system in which the individual finds his fulfillment or her fulfillment. That socialism, which is brought about in order to end exploitation through changes in property relations and so on, really does not worry too much about individual freedom. In fact, we know that the socialist countries we have had are essentially have been one-party dictatorships in which the dictatorship of the party has overridden the whole issue of individual freedom. Therefore, the proposition is that individual freedom is best attained under capitalism, but it is generally given short shrift under socialism, even when socialism's other achievements are recognized. Even then, it is the case that socialism doesn't really care too much about individual freedom. Now, I believe that both these propositions are mistaken. That really speaking, Marxism is as concerned about individual freedom as liberalism, if not more. And secondly, that the true individual freedom can only be attained under socialism and not under capitalism. The reason why I say this on the basis of an interpretation of Marx's writings is because in liberalism and in Marxism, there are two very different, diametrically opposite ways of looking at the role of the individual in a capitalist society. Liberalism sees capitalism as coming out of and forever being characterized by individual agency. That individuals come together to constitute the capitalist system. Adam Smith describes this very, very well. Pre-capitalist producers, before capitalism came into being, essentially what you had were people who are jack of all trades. You had to be a repairer, you had to be a kind of, suppose your cart broke down, you have to fix the cart, you have to prepare your food, you have to do everything. So before capitalism came into being, individuals were jacks of all trades. That's Smith's view. When capitalism comes into being, capitalism becomes essentially an instrument for social division of labor. That some people specialize in producing carts, some people specializing in repairing carts, some people specialize in cooking food or whatever, collecting food, or growing food. So capitalism is based on social division of labor where people specialize in particular activities. Now, if I'm doing 10 different activities and suddenly I specialize in one different activity, then in that particular period, for the 9 different activities, I would require someone else to provide me with my material requirements. Now, nobody else is doing that. Therefore, according to Adam Smith, there has to be a previous accumulation. I must have accumulated stocks which I can use vis-a-vis those 9 different activities so that I can specialize in only one of them. He called it previous or original accumulation of capital, which precedes capitalism, or which enables capitalism to come into being. And that is why some people who, because of their thrift, accumulate become capitalists, while others who don't accumulate become laborers, but they become laborers voluntarily because through the social division of labor, labor productivity increases, so they are better off being laborers than they were when they were in the pre-capitalist society being a jack of all trades. So capitalism is a voluntary arrangement. It is an embodiment of individual agency, and throughout the system, not only is the individual fulfilled, but what is more, the individual's actions in the aggregate lead to a socially better outcome. According to classical political economy, this socially better outcome took the form of an increase in the wealth of the nation. Smith's book was called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. Subsequent post-classical bourgeois economics, that is neoclassical theory that we know as neoclassical theory, more or less has the same philosophical biases, same philosophical conclusions, but of course refines it, changes the constituents of that theory. Firstly, it sees individuals as engaged in maximizing behavior, and that is supposed to be rational behavior. Every individual maximizes some function, some utility, or some reducing and minimizing cost or maximizing profits and so on. Every individual engages in some maximizing behavior subject to certain constraints. And the aggregation of all that is not only that the individual is better off compared to what he might otherwise have been if he was outside the system, but what is more, the system as a whole becomes socially better off, not in the Smithian sense of increase in the wealth of nations, but in a sense which is defined as Pareto optimality, namely that the system gets to a state where nobody can be made better off without somebody else being worse off. In other words, it gets to a state which is in some sense a social optimum. Now, all this presupposes that all resources must be used, because your rationality has no meaning. Suppose in a world in which there is unemployment, I act rationally, but I become unemployed. In that case, my rational action has no meaning. Rationality must imply that there has to be a correspondence between the intentions behind an action and the outcome of the action. If there is no correspondence, then there is no way that I can actually define any maximizing behavior. So individual rationality presupposes such a correspondence, and such a correspondence presupposes the full employment of all resources. The standard argument against it which was put forward by Keynes was the paradox of thrift. Everybody decides to be thrifty, but the outcome of it is that not that everybody's savings increase. Everybody decides, let us say, to be thrifty and double their savings out of their income. The outcome of it is not a doubling of savings, but a halving of incomes. So if individual intentions and the outcomes of the actions in the aggregate are different, then there is no way that the individual can maximize, can actually be rational in the neoclassical sense, and there is no way that the social outcome can be a desirable outcome. Now, from this also one can imagine that this is the working of capitalism, and Keynes was a person who actually investigated the working of capitalism. So Keynesian economics, in a sense, really cuts the ground from underneath that view of capitalism which actually saw individual liberty being achieved under capitalism. Individual liberty cannot be achieved if in the aggregate there is deficiency of aggregate demand, and there is therefore large masses of involuntary unemployment. Nobody can say that in the 1930s Great Depression, when Keynes was writing his thesis, individuals were enjoying freedom under capitalism. Okay, but then Keynes, who was, mind you, terrified of the Bolshevik Revolution, and was terrified that Bolshevik Revolution might happen in a country like Britain unless unemployment is removed, suggested that the state could intervene to remove unemployment. Now, the Keynesian prescription, which appeared to work for a while in the post-war years all over the capitalist world, in the sense that unemployment didn't disappear but was minimized, very small. I mean, in Britain there was 2% unemployment. In America during the Kennedy years there was just 4% unemployment, official figures. So, but on the other hand, these were very low by the historical standards of capitalism. So everybody said capitalism has changed, that we no longer have that old bad capitalism that actually had unemployment and so on, but now we have capitalism with state intervention. And look, this is so much a better system than the socialist system, which actually, true, it may be improving the condition of workers, but there's a suppression of individual rights. Now the point is that over time you actually found that Keynesianism gets completely replaced. So much is firstly, there is a theoretical attempt to discredit it. I don't know how many of you are economists, but the theoretical attempt takes the form. And this is the commonest theoretical position these days in bourgeois economics, that Keynes got his result because he assumed that money wages were fixed. That if you actually have flexible money wages, which is which is what the bourgeois theory assumes, in that case you wouldn't get involuntary unemployment, which is a completely wrong proposition. It would take me too long to discuss here, but it's a completely wrong proposition. The point is that Keynes gets his results, which had been anticipated by Marx, namely a tendency for insufficient aggregate demand and therefore overproduction crisis, because money is a form in which wealth is held. Marx assumed that money is a form in which wealth is held by his idea of the hoard. You remember Marx talks about the hoard that people have, and Keynes assumed that this is exactly that people hold money as a form of wealth. If money is held as a form of wealth, and money therefore, suppose I get some money against my sales, and for some reason do not immediately go and buy other goods, I'm holding on money as wealth, in which case demand for goods goes down, in which case there's involuntary unemployment. So involuntary unemployment, and no amount of flexibility of prices can get rid of it, because if prices fall, I may hold on to more money, anticipating there'll be more fall in prices. So the point is that there was a logical problem with bourgeois economics, which actually believed that individuals act rationally, but they are so irrational that they do not consider money to be a form of wealth, which is quite ridiculous. So the point is that Keynesianism was not only theoretically attacked, so much so that it is no longer theoretically now accepted in what is bourgeois economics. I'll tell you a story that basically a person came to JNU to do PhD from the London School of Economics. So we were very surprised. In the interview, we asked him, look, we are coming from London School to our center to do PhD. And the PhD was not in India. PhD was in Keynes. So we said, why? So he said, my supervisor in London told me that we don't do all this Keynes anymore. But I have heard that there's a place in Delhi called JNU where they still do Keynes. So you can actually go there and do your PhD. So this is the level to which Keynes has now been reduced. And what is more, we all know that there's a spontaneity of capitalism. I'll come to the crisis Keynesianism ran into, but let me then go back to the second concept, which is Marx's concept of the individual under capitalism. Already it has been summarized, but let me just very quickly go through it. That the individual under capitalism is not a person who is carrying out any individual agency of his own volition. The individual, of course, is acting under capitalism, but the individual is more or less compelled to act by the system in particular ways, more or less compelled to act by the system in the sense of competition within the system in particular ways. There are two very different concepts of competition involved. When you think of competition in bourgeois economics, that competition is absence of monopoly. Everybody acts as a price taker. When you think of competition in the Marxian sense, which is the competition in capitalism, that competition is Darwinian competition. That unless I do something, then I fall by the wayside. Unless the capitalist accumulates, then the capitalist is thrown out because others accumulate and displace him. Therefore, there's a Darwinian competition in which some get killed while others succeed in surviving. Thrown out of the system implies there must be an out. There must be something outside the system. That thing outside the system is the reserve army of labor. That therefore the system cannot do without a reserve army of labor, and it is this competition which actually forces individuals to act in particular ways, and the reserve army of labor is essential, particularly because while bourgeois economics may make some sense in an exchange economy, it can make no sense in a production economy. Because in a production economy, people have to act in a coordinated manner. It's not just a question of me selling something and buying something. People have to act in a coordinated manner. You remember Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times. When that conveyor belt comes to Charlie Chaplin, if he goes for a walk, in that case, production stops. So there has to be a discipline on every individual who is engaged in the production process to do the job that he or she is required to do in time. Now, this is something which, in a feudal system, production occurs because of the obvious coercion, the whip which is used by the monsignor against the serf. But in a capitalist system, there is no physical coercion, and therefore this is done through an extra physical coercion in the form of the right to fire that the employer has, and therefore if you don't do this, then out you go. If Charlie Chaplin goes for a walk when the conveyor belt, when the semi-finished product comes to him, then he's just thrown out. And for that being thrown out to be a punishment, there must be a group of people who are unemployed, because otherwise it's no punishment. So the point is that so this is something which basically implies that every individual is coerced into acting in particular ways, and the overall system therefore its behavior is the outcome of these actions which are imposed on individuals because of the compulsion of the system, because of the implicit coercion of the system, and these outcomes take the form of certain tendencies. Capitalism is a spontaneous system. It grows spontaneously, and this spontaneous system is one which is characterized, as Marx said, by certain immanent tendencies. Centralized centralization of capital, the fact that you turn everything into a commodity, the fact that there are no empty spaces, you can't just leave the tribals alone, you must invade them in order to find out if there is some minerals under their ground, and so on. So the aggressiveness of capitalism, the fact that it goes all over the world, the fact that everything becomes a commodity, the fact that there is centralization of capital, these are all immanent tendencies of capital, and capitalism develops these immanent tendencies irrespective of whether anybody likes them or not, wants them or not. Okay? And this spontaneity of capitalism also incorporates the state. The state is not outside of the system. Keynes's problem was that he actually thought in terms of the state as being an embodiment of social rationality outside of the system. Individuals act in all kinds of ways. Through their action, unemployment is generated. But the state as a wise thing, the state as the embodiment of social rationality would come in and rectify all this. As a matter of fact, if the state acts against the immanent tendencies of the system, then suppose we assume that the state acts against the immanent tendencies of the system, then of course the state creates a dysfunctionality in the system. And such a dysfunctionality actually happened. The fact is that the Keynesian system collapsed because of the inflationary crisis in which capitalism got engulfed at the end of the 1960s and early 70s. And that was because of the fact that once you had, as I said, 2% unemployment in Britain, 4% unemployment in the US, and decolonization of third world countries and so on. So once you had, as it were, a loosening of this coercive system, you actually found that the reserve army gets exhausted, the third world producers then assert themselves, and the net result is an inflationary crisis. Workers demand higher money wages, which capitalists are not willing to concede, which is why there's inflation. Third world countries want higher prices for their primary products. Some of them can be, as it were, kind of managed, but the oil producers were not managed in 1973 because of the fact that they had formed a cartel by then called OPEC. So the point is that the inflationary crisis was an outcome, was an expression of the fact that the Keynesian demand management cannot really rescue the capitalist system. And of course, by then, centralization of capital, which Marx had talked about, had gone so far that you now had huge masses of money, huge masses of money capital in all kinds of European and American banks. This money capital wanted to go global, and this money capital was totally opposed to inflation, because inflation reduces its value. Therefore, you actually had Thatcherism. Thatcher created an unemployment of 3 million people in Britain in order to beat down inflation. You had Reagan as well at the same time. So unemployment was generated against the Keynesian prescription of always having near full employment. Unemployment was regenerated on a mass scale in order to beat down inflation at the behest of finance capital, which was going global, and therefore you had the emergence of globalized finance capital. Thatcherism and the corresponding period in the US is, as it were, the kind of coming into being of that moment where finance capital begins to acquire ascendancy. Now the point is, we come back to this whole question of freedom under capitalism. Obviously, it follows that if individuals are not cooperating to form the system, if the system is acting in an impersonal manner, and if this impersonal manner exhibits in immanent tendencies that generate huge unemployment that causes massive distress to the individuals, in that case, obviously, there is no individual freedom under capitalism. As a matter of fact, every economic agent, even the capitalists, are alienated under capitalism. They cannot simply act the way they like. They can't go for a walk. They are actually coerced into acting in particular ways. And so, since capitalism is such a system, this system cannot, contrary to what liberalism believes, cannot provide individual freedom. The only way that individual freedom can be achieved is by transcending the spontaneous system. And transcending the spontaneous system can only occur in conditions when there is genuine cooperation among people. Nobody is coercing anybody else. And the genuine cooperation, a condition for that is people owning the means of production in common. And that is what we call socialism. Call it what you like, but a system that goes beyond capitalism, in which the ownership of means of production is common, is the one where alienation can be overcome and individual freedom realized. Now, that's the content of my book, but the point is that such a possibility, such a vision, is something which is not just, as it were, in one's mind. Of course, it's in one's mind, but I believe historically we have been pushed into a conjuncture today where it is urgent to act. Urgent to act not just to achieve individual freedom per se, because individual freedom or freedom of people is being ruthlessly suppressed at this moment. And this is because globalized capitalism or neoliberal capitalism, which represents the globalization of finance, which is really an expression of the globalization of finance, for a start, has actually, if you have globalized finance confronting the nation state, governments are of nation states, that means government policy cannot just do what it likes. Government policy has to willy-nilly accept the dictates of globalized finance, otherwise finance would flow out in large quantities, causing a huge financial crisis. Look at Syriza. Syriza was a left-wing organization that came to power in Greece, but could not take Greece out of this network of financial flows, and therefore had to do exactly what all previous governments in Greece were doing, and people voted it out. So it actually went against its electoral promise of doing something completely different. One example which I have given a couple of times in the last few days is that, look at, even when Nelson Mandela became the president of South Africa, there was so much outflow of finance that he had to appoint as his finance minister the same man who had been the finance minister under the apartheid regime. And why did he do it? Because of the fact that he had to assure globalized finance, assure internationally mobile finance, that no serious threat to them is being contemplated by the transfer of power from the apartheid regime to Nelson Mandela. And he did it not because he was trying to betray his promise and trust and so on, but because they were just not in a strong enough position to really impose capital controls. Now, in such a situation, I believe neoliberal capitalism, for a start, involves very substantial increases in income inequality. That's because in the advanced countries, the workers, because capital has become mobile, the advanced country workers are competing against third world workers. If you have American workers going on strike demanding higher wages, American capital would say, all right, we are going to China or we are going to India. And therefore, that is something that actually weakens the trade unions' bargaining strength, weakens the trade unions, and the workers, therefore, do not succeed in getting higher wages. In fact, Stiglitz made a calculation that the average real wage of a male American worker in 2011 was marginally lower than in 1968. Okay. In the third world countries, on the other hand, because capital is coming in and relocating activities in the third world for meeting international, for producing products for the international market, you may think that the labor reserves would get used up and therefore wages would start rising. That does not happen because of the fact that on the one hand, there is a crisis of peasant agriculture and petty production from whom state withdraws support. I don't have to explain to this audience the fact that the state in the neoliberal era has withdrawn support from peasant agriculture and petty production. It was withdrawing the last vestige of support which it still has, namely some kind of minimum support price for food grains, but that the farmers' agitation prevented, but it has been removed from cash crops, which is why you have all these suicides of 4 lakh people in the last 3 decades. So the point is that the state withdraws support, and this withdrawal of support pushes these sectors, peasant agriculture and petty production, into a crisis. 15 million cultivators, according to 2011 census, which is the last one we have had, were less compared to 1991 census. Some may have become cultivators, others must have gone to the cities in search of jobs. The job creation comes down because there is a huge increase in labor productivity, because competition, since trade opens up country borders, there is a huge competition between different countries to introduce new processes and new products. If you don't introduce, the Chinese would introduce and take away your markets, or the Indonesians would introduce and take away your markets. Therefore, the rate of labor productivity increase, rate of labor productivity growth rises. And that means, since employment growth is output growth minus labor productivity growth, the rise in labor productivity growth, even in a country like India, presumably, where output growth has been very high, the rise in labor productivity growth is so high that employment growth in the neoliberal period, on average, has been lower than it was in the pre-neoliberal period. Our output growth has, according to official figures, virtually doubled compared to the years before neoliberalism, but the employment growth has been halved from about 2% per annum to about 1% per annum in this period. So the reserve army of labor, because of the influx of displaced petty producers and peasants, and because of the fact that the labor productivity growth gets so reduced, almost equal to the rate of growth of the workforce, implies that the labor reserves keep increasing. So real wages don't rise here as well. So real wages don't rise in the global north, they don't rise in the global south. The only country where real wages rise has been China, and that's because of government diktat. That's not because of the play of demand and supply, but the government has actually dictated that please raise real wages. But otherwise, real wages have been extremely sluggish all over the world. But labor productivity is rising, which means that the share of economic surplus rises in output within countries and over the globe as a whole, because of which income inequalities increase. This is something which everybody now knows. The IMF is talking about rise in income inequality. The G7, G20, they're all talking about rise in income inequality. And that a rise in income inequality is really an expression of the functioning of neoliberal capitalism, one of the immanent tendencies of neoliberal capitalism. But this in turn precipitates a crisis, because obviously if income inequality rises, consumption doesn't rise as much, because the propensity to consume of the poor is much greater than of the rich. So consumption doesn't rise as much, which is why there's a crisis of overproduction, leading to a stagnation in the world economy. The decade 2012 to 21 is the lowest growth decade in the entire post-war period. And now things are slowing down even further. So there is stagnation under neoliberal capitalism, which has got hemmed in, which therefore is in a cul-de-sac. You may think that state intervention should remove this cul-de-sac, but state intervention can work only if the state can spend by taxing either the rich who save a part of their income, or by simply using a fiscal deficit. If the state finances 100 rupees by taxing the workers 100 rupees who spend the 100 rupees anyway, then workers' consumption goes down, state expenditure goes up by an equal amount more or less, and there's no net increase in aggregate demand. Therefore, state intervention is something which is dependent on these ways of state getting the wherewithal for expenditure, and of course both these are disliked by globalized finance. Financiers are the richest, they don't want taxes on the rich, and fiscal deficit is something that they don't like because of the fact that fiscal deficit serves to discredit, to delegitimize the capitalist system, and particularly the financiers who are supposed to be, who Keynes had called functionless investors. So both, and that's why in every country of the world virtually, except the US, you actually have fiscal responsibility legislation, that you can't have fiscal deficit more than 3% of GDP. And you just ask yourself the question, why this peculiar legislation? In all countries, you don't say that you can't spend less than 3% on health. You don't say you can't spend less than 6% on education, which is what the Kothari Commission had wanted India to do. But on the other hand, we have a law that actually says that you can't have a fiscal deficit larger than, in our case, 3% center, 3% states, 6%. So, because you can't have fiscal deficits, you can't have taxation of the rich, you actually find that state cannot overcome this crisis. So we have, under neoliberal capitalism, it has run into a cul-de-sac, it has run into a dead end. And two things which it is doing are particularly disturbing at the moment. One, of course, is the upsurge of neo-fascism all over the world. We know that when neoliberalism runs in, or when capitalism runs into a crisis, the big bourgeoisie then uses the help of fascist elements, as it had done in the 1930s, to prevent any threats to its hegemony. The fascist elements change the discourse. The fascist elements divide the working class and the working people, and the fascist elements other an alternative, a hapless minority, ethnic group, religious group, and so on, generate hatred against that ethnic or religious minority among the majority. And therefore, they not only divide the working people, but get the working people enmeshed in this contradiction, which is the change of discourse I was talking about. Now, this is something which is happening all over the world. Argentina, Poland, Hungary, India, US, Turkey, and so on. And where they are not in power, like in France or in Germany, they are knocking on the doors of power. AfD in Germany, Marine Le Pen in France. Therefore, there is an upsurge of fascism, which is really something which is very, very serious, and of course is not just a threat to freedom, it is complete abrogation of freedom. And the second thing that is happening as an expression of the response to the crisis is Trump's unilateral imposition of tariffs. That does not mean end of neoliberalism, because capital flows continue, but imposition of tariffs is basically export of unemployment. Whether Trump succeeds or not is a separate matter, depends on whether countries retaliate or not. But on the whole, the third world would not retaliate. The current regimes in the third world would not retaliate, as we already know. In fact, the Modi government has reduced tariffs on raw cotton imports from the US at a time when the US is raising tariffs on our exports to them. And raw cotton is one of those things which the farmers in Maharashtra and so on were growing, those who are most vulnerable to suicide. Therefore, you actually find that in the third world, in the coming days, the Trump's unilateral imposition of tariffs is going to bring even greater distress. Therefore, as far as we are concerned, the cul-de-sac of capitalism, the fact that it has reached a dead end, is going to be extremely hurtful for us, both because of the political imposition of neo-fascism and also the economic imposition of unilateral American tariffs. To fight this, to fight for freedom, and one of the main conclusions of my book is that socialism is an emancipatory project. It's not a project for raising production. Yes, of course, you can't have emancipation unless production rises, but fundamental preoccupation of socialism is that it is a freedom project. It's a project for emancipation. It's a project for overcoming the spontaneity of capitalism. Now, in order to, therefore, free individuals from both politically neoliberalism and economically the distress to which they would be pushed, they have been pushed and would be pushed further by the Trump tariffs and the crisis of stagnation of neoliberal capitalism, we have to, the left has to play a leading role in mobilizing the people. And this leading role must take the form not only of having political alliances against the neo-fascists, that of course is essential, but political alliances that actually take us out of this conjuncture that produces fascism. In other words, to overcome fascism, we must overcome the conjuncture that produces fascism. And that conjuncture is the crisis of neoliberalism. Therefore, we have to have also an economic component in whatever united front we form with other political elements that are willing to fight the neo-fascist rule in our country. And this economic element must be the introduction of a New Deal. I'm not saying, I mean, I would like this New Deal to take the form of the introduction of certain fundamental economic rights, universal, fundamental, justiciable, constitutionally guaranteed economic rights. I have mentioned in the book 5 possible economic rights for which we made calculations. One is the right to food, the other is the right to employment. If employment is not given, then the person must be paid a full wage. Right to a universal quality health care through a national health service, as existed in Soviet Union, as exists today in Scandinavian countries, and even in Britain, despite Britain whittling it down. The right to universal quality, publicly provided education for everybody. And of course, the right to a non-contributory living pension for everybody and corresponding disability benefits. These 5 rights would actually cost the exchequer an amount which can be raised simply by 2 taxes being imposed on the top 1% of India's population. One is a 2% wealth tax. The other is a 1/3 inheritance tax, that if I pass down my property, if I belong to the top 1%, I pass down my property, 1/3 of it is taken by the state. Other countries, capitalist countries, true blue capitalist countries, like Japan for instance, has inheritance tax in the form of death duty, which is 55%. Britain and US have got 40% death duty. I'm suggesting 1/3 inheritance tax. Very, very modest proposals. Now, I'm not saying that everybody is going to agree to all these fundamental rights and this and that, but at least some component of it must be there in order to convince people that what we are offering is a new deal. And consequently, the formation of a welfare state must be our way of counteracting fascism, not just politically, but also in economic terms. Thank you.